God.
Okay. Today we are using data from the Quantitative Environmental Learning Project. The data involves the wing length of houseflies. We found 100 measurements. Our data follows a normal distribution, also known as a bell curve. To create a bell curve, you need two major things, a mean and a standard deviation. Our mean is 45.5 and our sample standard deviation is 4. There are two ways to find a sample standard deviation, by hand and by calculator. First, by hand, the equation, as written here, is the square root of the sum of each value in the data set minus the mean squared all over the number of values in a data set minus 1. And you take the square root of that whole thing. And that should give you your sample standard deviation. The second way is by calculator. So you take your calculator, you turn it on, and you go to Stat, Edit, which should be the first thing to pop up, and you find your list 1, and you put all of your data points in there. And we had 100 data points. Then you hit Stat, Calculate, and you go to one variable statistics, which once again should be the first one to come up, and then you hit Calculate. And it should come up with your mean and your sample standard deviation, which our mean was 45.54, which we rounded up to 45.5 for our bell curve. So once you have your mean and your standard deviation, you can begin to make your bell curve. On your bell curve, the first thing you do is you put your mean in the very middle. Then you find each standard deviation away. So our standard deviation was 4. So 4 away from 45.5 is 49.5, which would be our first standard deviation, and so on and so on. And then you also go a negative. So negative 4 away from 45.5 is 41.5, which becomes our negative standard deviation. And then you do that on and on until you get about 4 standard deviations away. Between the first standard deviations, 68% of your data should fall. And 95% of the data should fall between the second standard deviations, and 99.7% of your data should fall between the third standard deviations. And once you have all that, then your bell curve is complete.